and we'll let you know when that gets rescheduled. I did something different this morning, as I talked about last week. While we were not here, we now have some phone lockers in the lobby, totally voluntary, but trying to set an example, I locked my phone up. So it's back there, so if you hear it ringing in the lobby, that's mine. I tried to put it on silent first, but if you don't have to do it, but if you find that every time you open the Bible app, you also get a Facebook notification that pulls you away and whatever, and you don't want that distraction, feel free to put your phone in a phone locker during worship. This has been a chaotic week for me. It's really been a very bad week. Lost a lot of sleep, just not been a good week. And sometimes I have those weeks. I imagine that you guys have some Sundays you come here thinking, it's been a rough week this week, and nobody knows it. But when I have a rough week, something that I'm really grateful for that makes my life a lot easier is my family. I know it's really nice, it's really comforting to know that when I get home, I'm in a place that I'm safe and I'm loved, a place that I can relax and be myself and be known, a place where the chaos of the world gets shut out to the outside, and I can truly be at home. But I also know that not everybody has this type of family. For some, their home life is a source of chaos. My heart breaks for families, or for people whose families are a source of abuse, neglect, or trauma. Even in strong, Christ-centered families, there are days, weeks, months, even seasons when chaos comes flying through the front door. And pain, illness, crisis, or arguing and bickering seems to become the norm. And I think the contrast between seasons of chaos and sweet seasons of peace in our own homes and families illustrates to us how much we need our homes to be places of unconditional love and peace from the storm. Because when we're in a season where home is a difficult place, life in general just gets a lot more difficult, doesn't it? When we're safe, we can face the chaos of the world because we know that we're coming back again home to safety. But when home is unsafe, the chaos of the world becomes nearly unbearable. Various researchers have studied this and named some effects, some psychological theories based on this idea. Bowlby and Ainsworth described it in attachment theory. Donald Winnicott describes it in the holding theory. But most of us would be somewhat familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs from 1943 in his groundbreaking paper, A Theory of Human Motivation, which actually really describes why we feel this way really well. Maslow suggests that human needs have to be met in a stepped order. Without first meeting the base, it doesn't do any good to meet the needs at the top. So, if you're dropped on a desert island, what's the first thing you're looking for? Water. And then food and shelter, right? And you know, you might mix the order of those three up, but if you ever watch a survival show, people that get those out of order don't make it very long, right? Water first, usually shelter second, and then food third, right? But those three are the first three. You don't get dropped in a desert island and say, boy, I hope I can find a job here that's really fulfilling and gives me a purpose. That's way, way, way up on the pyramid, right? Air, food, water, shelter is the first level of Maslow's pyramid. You got to meet those first. Once you've met those, the next level is safety, security, and stability. Then above those become relationship, family, and belonging. If a family home is healthy and doing what it's supposed to do, it should meet those lower needs first. Every home, every family should provide shelter, food, safety, security, relationship, and belonging. But not all families do. The higher levels, self-esteem, reputation, achievement, purpose, joy, personal growth, they can't come along unless that base is met. So now I'm going to give you an example about this from the Bible. There's a crazy story in the Old Testament book of Judges about a guy named Jephthah. His story comes out of Judges chapter 11. And the theme of the whole book of Judges is important here, and it comes out of the last verse of the book. If you're in the book of Judges, you flip all the way to the end, chapter 21, verse 25, you'll read this. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. In other words, chaos, anarchy, no moral compass, no safety, no security, no law. Everybody did what they thought was right. Whatever they thought was right is what they did. So when we're first introduced to Jephthah, this is the context he lives in. And it tells us that Jephthah was born to a prostitute, but raised in the household of his father and mother. That's an awkward dynamic, right? Now, all of his brothers were born to his father and mother. And so when they get old enough that they start to realize that one day there's going to be an inheritance from dad, these brothers say, well, we don't want to share our inheritance with the son of a prostitute, an illegitimate son, they call him. And so they abuse and mistreat Jephthah and run him not just out of the house, but out of the country. And so what we see next from Jephthah is that he goes to the land of Tob, and he takes up, and I love how the Bible says this in the NIV, with a gang of scoundrels. Sometimes your version might say worthless men. These men were mercenaries. We know from history and from another reference in the Bible that the men of Tob were mercenaries, soldiers at hire to the highest bidder. They had no allegiance or loyalty. They didn't care who they fought for, just whoever had the most cash. Apparently these scoundrels were good for something, because living with them, Jephthah he got a reputation as quite a fierce fighter. So when the people, many years later, in his father's hometown, needed help putting together a militia to fight off their enemies, the oppressors from Ammon, the Ammonites, they came to get him and asked him to be their commander. In exchange, after the war, he would become their leader, their governor, their city king. I don't know exactly what context, but he made them promise that he would become the chief among them all in exchange for leading them amongst the Ammonites, because he is at heart a mercenary. So he leads this militia to fight against the Ammonites, and here's where the story gets really messy and wacky, and the reason that we don't really talk about this story very often. You probably haven't heard it preached much before, and this is why. Before good old Jep goes into battle, he makes a vow to the Lord that if God will give him victory, he will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his door to meet him when he returns home. He fights, he wins, he returns home, and his daughter comes out to greet him. And poor misguided Jephthah keeps his vow and sacrifices his daughter. Let's stand and sing. Think about this. We have a guy who grew up without his most basic needs being met. No safety, no security, no sense of belonging. In fact, he was run out of his home, so he didn't even have food, water, or shelter being provided to him. He had to learn to scrape by using whatever means necessary to survive. He has been taught from birth that people are not trustworthy, that a father is not faithful, and that children are expendable. He was taught that. How on earth is this guy supposed to be able to go beyond that base he never got and achieve moral development or get a view of God as a good father? So without a healthy family foundation, he grows up with a very warped sense of who God is. The scoundrels he hangs out with are mercenaries, soldiers for hire. They've worked for the Ammonites, the very people he is now fighting against. So he knows about the Ammonites. And what does he know about the Ammonites? That they worship a god named Molech. And that some of the worship of Molech and another similar or maybe parallel deity named Milakach involves the sacrifice of children. So his vow doesn't seem as rash to him as it does to us. We always assume that Jephthah didn't think about the fact that his daughter would come out of his gate, that he thought it would be a sheep or a goat or a chicken. But in his worldview, the enemy was swearing to their God that if he would give them victory, they would sacrifice their children. Jephthah doesn't want to make that vow, but he doesn't want to not make that vow. So he says, if I fight against them and they've raised the pot, I'll match their bet by saying I'll sacrifice anything that comes out my door. Wink, wink, nod, nod, make it a chicken. But whatever it is, I'll do it because I want to show you that I'm just as willing to dedicate myself as they are. And the reason that he does that is because he assumes that the God of his people is like the God of their people. He assumes that their God is a real God, and his God will only defeat their God if he's as angry or motivated as their God is. And if they're willing to sacrifice their children, he should be willing to sacrifice his. It wasn't the unfortunate accident that we think that it might have been. God never wanted that vow. It's clear from the story of Abraham getting ready to sacrifice Isaac and God stopping him that God had no desire for child sacrifice and was pushing back against the culture around them to make a statement for his people for all time that child sacrifice would not ever be part of his worship. But Jephthah probably wasn't really taught that story. God didn't want the vow, and he did not want Jephthah to honor the vow. The whole story is a tragedy preserved for us to illustrate just how far the country, the people, and the families had fallen away from God. But something really cool happens in the New Testament when Jesus comes along. In Mark chapter 5, there are a series of stories that start with Jesus crossing east of the Jordan, which is where Jephthah lived. So Jesus starts this series, this group of stories that are grouped together, by crossing into the geographical area that Jephthah lived in. And he heals a demon-possessed man, he gets in a boat, and he comes back across the Sea of Galilee, and as he's exiting the land where Jephthah lived, he is met on the shores of the sea by a man named Jairus. This is in Mark chapter 5, verses 22 through 24. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so Jesus went with him. And if you know the story, you know that by the time Jesus got there, she was no longer dying, she was dead. Jephthah was a leader of the people. Jairus was a leader of the people. Interestingly, the name Jairus in the same spelling, but in Greek, appears in the Greek version of the Old Testament in the same spelling as the judge that immediately preceded Jephthah. Anytime that happens, to the Hebrew reader and the Greek reader, they make a connection. And we have a linguistic connection, and now we have a geographical connection, and now we have a storyline connection between daughters that are dying or dead. Jephthah killed his daughter. Jairus' daughter died. Jephthah lost a daughter because he did not know God, and Jairus met God, and his daughter was raised from the dead. A number of scholars have commented that they believe that the early readers of the New Testament would have read this story, the early Hebrew readers would have read this story and immediately said Jesus was reversing the story of Jephthah. That Jephthah was a tragedy that God left there preserved for us to inform us of how not to worship him. And Jesus comes along and creates a restoration story of God's intent of restoring life and restoring families by God being close and walking with families rather than God being far away and demanding a sacrifice of a child. God would much rather restore life than take life. God is a God of restoration, life, hope, and love. Our God believes in families and homes which overflow with love to meet children's needs. So in these two contrasting stories, we see that part of God's plan for love to overflow from us into the world is intended to start with Christian homes and families where children's needs are met. Can you imagine if Jephthah had been raised in a place where he never would have had to worry about the types of concerns, where he would have known that God is a good father who loves his children, and the tragedy could have been avoided? We meet the needs of our families. First with shelter, water, and food, then with safety and security, then with relationship, love, and belonging, and on from there to moral development, self-esteem, purpose, and joy. And when we do this, not only will our homes be happy and healthy for us and our children, but they will also be welcoming places of peace from the chaos of our friends and neighbors and our children's friends who can't find those things in their own homes. When you feed a neighborhood child who is hungry and doesn't have enough to eat in their home, or when you model respect and kindness between a husband and wife that they don't see in their own parents, when you offer love and relationship to people who feel alone in their own household, you give them a glimpse into the kingdom of God. One great illustration of this happening in community and in chaos is in London during the Blitz in World War II. Now, some of you are history buffs. You're way ahead of me. But if you don't know, for 8 months between 1940 and into 1941, the Germans bombed London nearly every single night for 8 months straight. During this time, there were about 30,000 who were killed, and the city was left in ruins. Now, we're pretty conditioned in our world to understand that bombing is at least supposed to happen to infrastructure and military. But we also know that it often doesn't. But in World War II, it wasn't even supposed to happen that way. The Germans purposely targeted civilian populations to instill terror, to incite terror in the population. They wanted the people to be terrified and to press their leaders into withdrawing from the war. And so these were bombs. Yes, there were some that were military infrastructure, but many, many of the bombs were destroying your neighbor's house as you lay in bed. I cannot imagine living for 8 months with the constant terror as bombs were going off all around you every night and half the city was on fire. Talk about a life of chaos outside of your home. Now, London has a fire force. They're called the Fire Brigade. And they had a massive task every day and every night of putting out the fires and trying to save the lives of the victims. So obviously, one of the most important pieces of equipment that every firefighter took out with them on every run was a full tea service. The Brits and their tea, right? Tea is a way of life in England. It's part of daily life. And as part of that, the fire brigade, putting out fires and pulling out people from burning buildings, also had people preparing and serving cups of tea to everyone around. Why? Boy, it just feels like a terrible waste of resources, right? It's like, put down the tea and pick up a hose over here, guys. But they knew something. They knew that in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the terror, in the middle of everything, that cup of tea could symbolize hope, peace, normality, comfort, solidarity, community, and family. And so it became essential that every fire brigade that went out carried a full tea service and served tea to reassure the people around them that even though the world around them was falling apart, the people of London would continue to meet each other's needs. I tell you that story to say that sometimes weeks like this one has been for me, maybe has been for you, are chaotic, even painful. Sometimes the seasons in your home may be ones that involve conflict, loss, changes, or even trauma. What do you do then to restore peace? You do the next right thing. You serve a cup of tea. You cook dinner for your spouse, even though you're furious with them. You help your kid with homework, even though you just had to ground them because they were back-talking you and disrespecting you. You come home from work or school even when you'd rather drive off and go somewhere else. You make the choice that you will not let chaos reign in your home. You do the next right thing. You serve a cup of tea. You believe that it's the right thing to do to meet each other's needs because you believe that Christ came to meet our needs on the cross by bringing us life in place of death, peace in place of chaos, joy in place of grief. And the hope is that that joy, that life, that peace will then overflow out of us and out of our families and out of our homes and across the yard and across the street and up the driveway and into the next house. And that will be a beautiful witness to the glory of God.